All right, let's get into it. Today, we're basically handing you a magnifying glass and a deerstalker hot. We're going to crack open the Logic Detective's field guide to one of the most powerful tools out there for picking arguments apart, the categorical syllogism. So let's jump right in and look at our first case.
So here's our first case file. Read it over. On the surface, it sounds pretty logical, doesn't it? It just seems to flow from one point to the next. But, as any good detective knows, things are not always what they seem. So the real question is this argument actually valid? And how can we be 100% sure? Well, that's the case we're cracking today.
Okay, so before we can deliver any kind of verdict, we have to break this thing down. We got to look at its component parts. See, every argument has this kind of hidden structure, like a logical skeleton. And our first job, as detectives, is to find that skeleton by identifying the key pieces of evidence. First up is what we'll call evidence tag A, the major term. Now, this is always the predicate of the conclusion. So in our case, the conclusion is some members of the administration are liberals. That means the predicate and our major term is the word liberals. Simple enough. Next, we've got evidence tag B, the minor term. And you can probably guess this one. It's the subject of the conclusion. So back to some members of the administration are liberals, the subject is members of the administration. And boom, that's our minor term. We've just identified the two main characters in our little logic story. And here is the really crucial link, the piece that connects the other two, the middle term. Now, you'll find this term in both of the opening statements. We call those the premises, but then it just kind of vanishes by the time we get to the conclusion. In our case, it's proponents of national health insurance. This is the term that's supposed to build a bridge between our minor and major terms. Now, we can't just have all our evidence scattered around the crime scene, right? No. To analyze an argument properly, we need to arrange its parts in a very specific, universal order. Think of it just like bagging and tagging evidence. In logic, we call this standard form. And yep, there's a specific procedure for this. You always start with the conclusion to find your major term. That then points you to the major premise. That's the sentence that contains that term. The other premise, well, that's our minor premise. Then you just rewrite the whole argument in that specific order. Major premise first, minor premise second, and the conclusion last. Getting this standardized form right is absolutely key to analyzing the structure correctly. So, with our evidence all neatly organized, we can now create a unique profile, kind of like a logical fingerprint for our argument. This profile has two parts, and together they tell us everything we need to know about the argument's structure. The first part of that profile is its mood. This is basically a 3-letter code that tells you the type of each statement. For example, an A statement is a universal affirmative, like all liberals are proponents. An I statement is what's called a particular affirmative, like some members of the administration are. So we just list the letter for each statement, in standard form order, of course, to get the argument's mood. Now, the second part of the profile is the figure. So the mood tells us what kind of statements we have, but the figure, that tells us their shape. And it's all determined by the position of that all-important middle term within the first two sentences. And as you can see from this table, there are only 4 possible ways that middle term, which we label M, can be arranged. So depending on whether M is the subject or the predicate in the premises, we get one of these 4 figures. When you put the mood and the figure together, you get the argument's complete, unique logical fingerprint. Okay, we've organized the evidence, we've created a profile for our suspect. Now it's time for the forensic analysis. We're taking this argument to the lab to run it through 2 really rigorous tests that will tell us, once and for all, if it's valid or invalid. So our lab has 2 main tools. The first is the visual test. This is where we use Venn diagrams to literally see if the logic holds up. The second is the rulebook test, a checklist of 6 unbreakable laws of logic. And if an argument violates even one of these, it's invalid. Game over. The Venn diagram test is pretty cool in its simplicity. You just draw 3 overlapping circles for your 3 terms, and then you map out the 2 premises on that diagram. Now, here's the magic part. If the argument is valid, the conclusion will just automatically appear in the diagram. You don't have to do anything else. And this really gets us to the absolute core principle of all of this. It doesn't matter one bit if the argument is about liberals or rabbits or starships. As the source material puts it, the validity or invalidity of any syllogism depends entirely on its form. We're not testing what it's saying, we're testing the skeleton holding it up.
All right, now for the rule book test. Here on the screen are the 6 fundamental laws of logic. Every single valid argument has to obey every single one of these rules, no exceptions. For our case, we're really going to zoom in on rule number 2. The middle term must be distributed at least once. So, what does distributed mean? Well, a term is distributed if the statement says something about all the members of that class. Like in the sentence, all dogs are mammals, the term dogs is distributed. You'll see why this is so important in just a second. And that brings us to one of the most common logical crimes out there, the fallacy of the undistributed middle. This is what happens when you violate rule number 2. It happens when that middle term isn't distributed in either premise. That means neither statement is actually talking about all the members of that middle group. And if that's the case, you have no guaranteed connection between the major and minor terms. It's a fatal flaw in the argument. Okay, the lab results are back. It is time to bring our original case file back to the stand. We've profiled it, we've gone over the rulebook, now let's apply the test and find out the verdict. And here it is, the verdict. Our argument, which has the profile AI2, breaks rule number 2. The middle term, proponents of national health insurance. It isn't distributed in either premise. Neither of the first 2 sentences makes a claim about all proponents. And because of that, the argument is guilty of committing the fallacy of the undistributed middle. The connection it tries to make simply isn't guaranteed. And there you have it. Case closed. What sounded so plausible at the very beginning turns out to be, after a close inspection, a logically invalid argument. Now, this is important. Its conclusion might just happen to be true in the real world, but the premises don't force it to be true. Our detective work has found the hidden structural flaw. So now let's just zoom out for a second. We've just looked at one specific argument, but how many of these possible structures are there? Well, with 64 possible moods and 4 possible figures, it turns out there are a total of 256 unique forms a categorical syllogism can take. And out of all 256 of those possible argument shapes, how many do you think are actually logically valid? Just 15. That's it. And here they are. This is the master list, the 15 airtight, logically perfect forms. These are the only structures that are guaranteed to work every single time, no matter what you plug into them. Classical logicians even gave them these fun, memorable names like Barbara and Celerant, just to identify these perfect blueprints for valid reasoning. So we're leaving you with the Logic Detective's toolkit. You now have the ability to identify the terms, put an argument into standard form, profile its mood and figure, and then test it against the ironclad rules of logic. So the real question is, what arguments that you hear every single day are you now going to put under that magnifying glass?